There once lived a merchant named Marcel. He was a widower, and all his hopes for rebuilding the life he envisioned for his 6 children rested upon a fleet of ships into which he had poured his entire fortune. Storms, mischance, and the long arm of fate do not always respect our careful plans. One by one, those ships were swallowed by distance and silence until there was nothing left to wait for. Marcel had no wife to whom he needed to bring this grim news. His beloved had passed away years earlier, but he did have 6 children who had grown up with the comforts of privilege and the expectations that comfort often brings. When word spread through town that the merchant's fortune had failed and that creditors wanted their payments with a sternness that allowed no compromise whatsoever, the family's life changed with startling speed. Weeks turned to months, and still no sails appeared in the harbor. Piece by piece, the things that had once surrounded them disappeared. The grand dining table went first, then the tall mirror framed in carved wood, then the carriage that had taken them to festivals, and at last the jewels and fine gowns that had seemed part of the daughters' very identities. Finally, the large house with its polished stair rails and its polished reputation had to be given up as well, and the family moved to a small cottage set at the edge of town where the roofs are lower and the streets grow quiet as soon as evening comes. Marcel traveled often because he had to. He met contacts, called on former business partners, and looked for anyone who might extend a hand so he could begin anew. While he was away, the children were left to keep the household going on their own. They were old enough for responsibility. Their ages placed them directly on the border between youth and adulthood. Yet knowledge gained in drawing rooms and gardens is not the same as knowledge earned by tending fires and washing floors, and the 3 sons and the 2 eldest daughters proved nearly powerless when the moment came to act. They were clever, yes, and full of opinions certainly, but as for the practical chores that keep a home standing, those skills they simply did not possess. The youngest child, however, was different. Her name was Elodie. Perhaps it was because she stood at that youthful age when the heart remains impressionable and hope clings with both hands. Or perhaps it was because her nature was truly gentle, steadfast, and quietly bright. Whatever the reason, Elodie stepped toward work rather than away from it. She tied on an apron, asked questions, and listened carefully to the answers. She learned how to mix dough with hands that warmed it into rising. She learned to mend seams with stitches so even that the seams looked better than before. She taught herself the rhythm of watering a garden, not too much and not too little, and how to gather eggs without startling the hens. At first, the villagers watched with reserve. They knew who this family had been, and they were accustomed to former nobles who came to the edge of town and acted as if the world owed them favor. But Elodie greeted each person with a respectful kindness that did not feel forced. She stood in doorways and asked for advice with honesty that contained no pride. She practiced what she learned, brought loaves to neighbors as thanks, and laughed with the children who played in the lanes. Slowly, suspicion turned into approval, and approval, day by day, turned into genuine affection. Elodie became, without any announcement at all, the thread that held the family together when it might otherwise have come apart. In contrast, her brothers and older sisters resisted the change with every fiber of their being. They wore their discontent like heavy cloaks and complained with an intensity that left them exhausted. They did not attempt to win favor with the people who lived beside them. They did not try to master even simple tasks. They waited for fortune to reverse itself while Elodie quietly kept the hearth burning, swept the stone floor, and made sure there was soup in the pot when their father returned from yet another long search for hope. 2 years of such living went by. 2 years of early mornings and modest meals. 2 years of learning that a carefully tended garden can reward a family better than a warehouse full of promises. Then, on a morning that began like any other, a messenger knocked at the cottage door and brought astonishing news. One of Marcel's lost ships had been seen in the harbor, and what was more, its cargo was said to be largely intact. The older children shouted with triumph. They proclaimed that at last their life among villagers was over, and they began to imagine, with great detail and great eagerness, all the ornaments and entertainments that would return to them. Elodie smiled for their sake. She truly did, but inside she felt something tender and complicated. In the simple cottage with its swept floor and well-scrubbed table, she had discovered a kind of contentment she had not known before. The scent of bread baking in the low oven, the neatness of a garden path she had laid with her own hands, the sense of being useful every single day, these had become treasures to her in a way jeweled clasps had never been. She wanted her family to be relieved of worry. She wanted them to feel secure again. Yet she was not certain she wanted to return to that distant, idle life where the hours were dressed in silk but emptied of purpose. To claim what might remain of his property, Marcel would have to travel to the port by horse. He expected to be gone a few days. Once his affairs were put in order, he planned to hire a comfortable coach for the journey back. Before he left, in a spirit both hopeful and fatherly, he asked each of his children to tell him what gift they wished him to bring. The elder siblings seized the opportunity at once. One of the sons wanted a finely cut coat with silvered buttons that would catch the light. Another asked for boots made of soft leather and a hat trimmed elaborately. The daughters requested ribbons that would cascade like waterfalls and capes lined with velvet. And there was talk of furs and jewels that would declare to everyone that the family's fortunes had been restored completely. Only Elodie remained quiet. When her father noticed and urged her gently to speak, she answered in a voice that carried both shyness and sincerity. "Father, there is something I have longed to see with my own eyes since I was little. In this region it does not grow, and it has always seemed to me both rare and precious. If you can find it, and if it does not bring you trouble to do so, would you bring me a single rose, in whatever color you happen to find?" Marcel chuckled, fondness warming his features at this curious request, and agreed at once. In his thoughts, he resolved to add a small necklace or delicate trinket as well, because he felt a fatherly joy at the idea of surprising his youngest child. When the morning of departure arrived, the weather was fair. Elodie, careful as always, packed his saddlebags with bread, cheese, apples, and a small jar of honey she had traded for with a neighbor. She adjusted the strap so it would not chafe the horse and wished her father a heartfelt farewell. There was a shimmer of tears in her eyes, not of fear but of tenderness. The others waved without much attention. They were already discussing fabrics and jewelers. Marcel guided his horse onto the forest road, where sunlight slipped between the leaves and painted the path with patches of brightness and shade. Elodie stood at the gate and watched until the last glimmer of his coat vanished among the trees. A quiet unease lingered in her chest, like a cloud that would not quite dissolve, but she said nothing. Had not good fortune finally returned? Marcel rode with urgency, his mind full of plans that unfolded one after another. The ship would provide the seed for a renewed business, he told himself. He would be careful this time and deliberate. He would build slowly and wisely. He imagined the crates opening and the scent of spices rising. Imagined the sheen of silk sliding over careful fingers. Imagined his name spoken with respect once more by those who had doubted him. All the while, the horse carried him forward to the city by the sea. But reality can be as quick and unforgiving as a storm over open water. When Marcel reached the port, his hopes were crushed with a thoroughness that left him shaken. It was true, the ship had come back and most of its cargo had survived the voyage. It was also true that news travels very fast indeed when money is involved. Marcel's creditors had acted swiftly, decisively, and with absolutely no hesitation whatsoever. By the time he arrived, the entire cargo had been seized and divided to settle the debts recorded against his name. He spent the day going from one merchant to another, explaining, negotiating, pleading for time. He asked for extensions with humility, presented ideas for repayment with careful logic, and even appealed to old friendships he had thought would matter. None of it helped in the least. At sunset he possessed no debts, yes, but he also possessed no coin, no shares of cargo, no promise he could bring home like a flame held safe in a lantern. There was not even enough left to purchase a simple present for his children. No silk shoes, no bright buckles, not even the smallest ribbon. The rose that Elodie had wished for so tenderly seemed far away as well. Disheartened more than he had been in years, Marcel could not bear to remain in the city overnight. Without making sensible preparations for the road, without writing ahead to his children, and without truly considering the weather that had begun to change, he mounted his tired horse and turned back toward home. Dusk gave way to darkness. The clouds thickened, the wind found its voice, and then the storm arrived for real. Rain hurled itself at the earth. Thunder cracked in a way that felt almost personal. Lightning stitched jagged patterns across the sky. Startled, the horse shied from a broken limb in the road and bolted into the trees, away from the path Marcel knew. Branches struck against his coat. The undergrowth clutched at the horse's legs. The night became a swirling thing of rain and noise, and Marcel realized, with a sinking clarity, that he had made a foolish decision in choosing to ride out instead of waiting for morning. He pulled on the reins and spoke to the horse in a tone that he hoped sounded calm. They pushed through a tangle of dark trunks and dripping leaves, searching for any kind of shelter. Some rocky overhang, some hollow, anything at all that would keep them from the violence of the wind. After what felt like hours, a stone wall appeared ahead, looming out of the rain. Marcel slowed, following its length until he reached a tall iron gate that stood slightly ajar, as if a large hand had pulled it half open and then forgotten to close it. He slid from the saddle, pushed the heavy gate wide enough for the horse, and stepped through. Inside, a paved path, made bright and slick by rain, ran into the depths of a large estate. He led the horse along it, passing through clusters of trees that shook and whispered under the storm's command. At last a building came into view, a house so vast that even in the stuttering light it felt imposing. Tall windows rose like solemn eyes. A long front with identical wings on both sides stretched into the darkness, and above, a steep roof bristled with chimneys. Marcel's exhaustion and common sense argued together, and need one. He guided the horse into a sheltered alcove off the main steps, tied the reins securely, and clapped the horse's shoulder in thanks. Then he climbed to the door, a door that must have taken several strong people to hang when the house was new. He lifted the iron knocker and let it fall. The sound rolled off into the hallways beyond, or so he imagined, and for a moment it even seemed to answer the thunder as if the house itself were aware of his presence. No footsteps approached. No candlelight bobbed in a welcoming way. Marcel waited, shivering. When no reply came, he pressed his shoulder against the door and pushed. Yielded. He stumbled forward into a grand entry, caught himself, and stood very still while the echoes of his arrival faded. The interior was large and formal, but there was a hush upon it, a hush that felt not only empty but ancient. Curved staircases arched upward on both sides like the wings of some great bird folded in repose. Suits of armor stood in several alcoves, their helmets turned toward the center as if they had been placed to watch those who came and went. Directly opposite, a pair of beautifully carved double doors showed the faintest suggestion of light along the crack where they met. Marcel called out, just a brief greeting that stated his need for shelter, spoken with as much respect as a weary man could command. His voice was swallowed by the stillness. He cleared his throat, smoothed the water from his hair, and walked toward the doors. He pushed them open and leaned into a room that immediately felt warmer, more human, than the hall. A fire blazed in an immense hearth, and in front of it stood a table laid for a single person. A loaf of bread with a neat heel cut away, roasted meat that shone with its own juices, a small plate of late summer fruit, a carafe, and a large glass that caught and reflected the firelight like a small pool. The rest of the room revealed upholstered chairs softened by long use, and books stacked upon side tables as if someone had been reading in several places at once and set the volumes down carelessly. There was no sign of a host. Marcel waited, feeling the heat of the fire lift the chill from his bones. He told himself he would explain everything when the owner returned. The storm, the dangerous road, the fear for his horse. But hunger has its own logic, and the smell of the food made him ache. He began with a single slice of bread. Nothing more, he promised himself, and then took another and then another. The roasted meat was tender, the fruit bright, the drink in the glass surprisingly refreshing. Minutes slid by and still no one appeared. At last he allowed himself to sit fully at the table and finish the meal that had been waiting there. He ate slowly as a respectful guest would, but he ate it all the same. Afterward he leaned back, satisfaction and gratitude loosening his tired body. He lifted the carafe and poured the last of its contents into the glass, thinking again of the letter in his pocket, the letter that had once signified hope and now felt like a cruel trick. He placed that letter on the table and pushed it away as if distance could lessen its sting. The fire danced and murmured, and the chair supported him with the kind of comfort that suggests years of use by someone who loved this room. Without intending it in the least, Marcel's eyes drifted closed and he fell into a deep sleep without dreams. When morning arrived, he woke with a moment of confusion, as we all do sometimes in an unfamiliar place. The fire had burned to ashes long ago. The dishes and glass from his meal remained visible on the table exactly as he had left them, without the slightest sign that anyone had entered during the night. The air of the room contained that same curious hush. Shame began to prickle. He had, after all, entered a stranger's home without permission, eaten a stranger's food without asking, and fallen asleep by a stranger's fire. Embarrassment, polite, insistent, and impossible to argue with, told him to leave quickly and quietly before the owner returned and found him there. He rose, adjusted his coat, and walked back through the carved doors into the entry hall. In the gray light of morning, he could see more clearly than he had the night before. The runners that flowed down the twin staircases were faded and dusty, threaded with neglect. The suits of armor wore a film upon them as if no hand had polished them in years. The silence was not merely the everyday silence of a house whose master was away. It was the deeper absence that settles when life has been missing for a long time. Marcel crossed the flagstones on light feet, as if sound itself could summon watchful eyes from nowhere. He reached the front door, placed both hands on the handles and pulled. The heavy door resisted, then sighed open as if exhaling a story it had been holding all night. He slipped through the gap into a mist-filled courtyard and eased the door shut behind him until the latch settled. He straightened his waistcoat, an instinctive gesture, an attempt to recover dignity, and told himself he would do his best to forget this strange detour entirely. He hurried to the alcove where his horse had been tied. She lifted her head at the sound of his step, ears flicking forward. Relieved, he reached into the saddlebag and found one apple Elodie had tucked there for him. He split it and fed it to the horse in 2 generous pieces, rubbing the soft stretch of her nose as she chewed. Then he untied the reins, turned her carefully, and led her back along the stone path that wound through the grounds toward the gate through which they had entered. The storm had passed, but beads of water still clung to leaves and iron and stone, glittering like a million small promises that would vanish once the sun rose higher. When he reached the gate, instinct made him look back. In the new light, the house, the chateau, stood in clear detail. It was long and rectangular, built of pale stone that had weathered toward a quiet beige. A central block formed the heart, with identical wings stretching to either side with such symmetry that it created an impression of order bordering on sternness. The windows were tall and narrow, stacked in a formal rhythm across 2 large floors. They looked down as if they were watchful, as if they had once observed lively arrivals and now observed departures that were far more subdued. The tiled roof sloped steeply and was crowded with chimneys, so many that they resembled a small forest of brick and stone. Marcel felt a ripple of unease break across his skin. He could not say why. Perhaps it was the strangeness of having found warmth and food prepared for one and yet meeting no host whatsoever. Perhaps it was the way the great house seemed at the same time abandoned and alert, neglected and yet not asleep. He tightened his grip on the reins, passed under the ironwork of the gate, and started along the road that would lead him back toward the life he knew, toward his children, toward Elodie who would listen with her whole heart, and toward whatever new trial or mercy the day would bring. As the horse's hooves clicked softly upon the stones, Marcel promised himself he would be careful with his telling. He would not alarm his family. He would not describe the house as hostile because it had sheltered him. He would not call it welcoming because it had offered no greeting. He would say only what was precisely true, that a storm had driven him from the road, that a wall had appeared, that behind a gate there had been a mansion with a hearth alight and a table set, and that in the morning he had left it as quietly as any thankful trespasser could. He would keep to facts and leave out interpretations, because sometimes interpretations trouble the mind more than the events themselves. Yet as he rode, he could not stop thinking of Elodie's request, that gentle wish for a single rose. It seemed such a small thing and yet somehow more difficult now than any embroidered cape or jeweled clasp his older children had demanded with such certainty. He had promised himself he would bring it to her if he could. He had promised her in words, and promises given to the youngest and kindest child of a household have a way of glowing in a father's memory. As the mist thinned and the morning gathered itself toward day, Marcel held that promise close, like a fragile bloom he could not yet see but could already feel, as real as the breath that warmed the air between him and the horse who carried him steadily onward. He glanced once more over his shoulder. The chateau was almost lost behind the trees now, only that dense forest of chimneys still visible above the green. He whispered something that was not quite a farewell and not quite a prayer, something simple and honest, and then faced the road ahead, letting the rhythm of the ride steady him. Whatever waited for him next, explanations, disappointments, or the quiet relief of home, he would meet it, because that is what one does when day follows night and an old story takes its time unfolding, step by gentle step. Turning his back on the stern silhouette of the great house, he guided the mare toward the front gate, noticing on either side the gardens that had once been carefully designed and were now lavishly overgrown. Just before the path ended, his eye caught on a small pergola, charming despite its neglect, entirely claimed by climbing roses. In the center of a circular sitting nook, a single bush overflowed with blossoms, an astonishing profusion of vivid pink blooms more exquisite than any he had ever seen in his life. In a heartbeat, he remembered the promise he had made to Elodie. Determined to keep his word to his youngest child, Marcel reached into his bag, drew out the small knife he always carried, and set about cutting the flowers. One would not suffice, not for a pledge given with such warmth. He would bring a generous armful. He would bring them all. He worked quickly, entirely absorbed, so intent that he failed to notice the approach of footsteps. Only when he stepped back from the now stripped bush, its branches left bare where petals had been moments before, did the unmistakable sensation of being watched prickle along his skin. He turned. A figure towered over him. At first glance it seemed a man. At second, something other. The stranger's face was half hidden under a wild growth of hair, and his frame was unnaturally tall and powerfully built. He wore a wrinkled linen shirt and rough breeches as if he had thrown them on in a hurry and stormed out without a thought for appearances. Fury burned in his eyes. "What do you suppose you are doing?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl that reminded Marcel of a wolf warning intruders from its den. Marcel froze, the heavy bouquet dragging at his left hand. Stammering, he explained that he had believed the estate to be empty, that he had assumed the roses would not be missed at all, and, seeing no softening whatsoever in that fierce expression, he added weakly that he had promised a rose to his daughter, who had longed for one for years. The wild-looking man said nothing at first. He regarded Marcel in a long, measuring silence, as if weighing the worth of every word. Then he drew himself up to his full height. "You entered my home without asking. You ate the supper that had been prepared. You slept by my fire. I allowed all of that to pass without confronting you. But now you have stripped every bloom from my most cherished rosebush. It holds deep personal meaning for me. There is not another like it anywhere, and each of those blossoms is priceless in my eyes. You will compensate me." Hearing this, Marcel felt his heart drop like a stone. He shook his head, defeated. He told the stranger there was nothing he could pay, no coin, no goods, nothing whatsoever. The stern host looked at him coolly. "Then you will work off your debt," he said, with finality that admitted no argument. "I require labor on this estate." Marcel gaped, words tangling on his tongue as he tried to find another solution. "Sir, I have 6 children at home," he protested. "I cannot remain here indefinitely. What will become of them?" The man was unmoved. "Either you remain and work until I consider the debt repaid, or a member of your family comes in your stead," he declared. "Take your flowers. They are of no use to me now. Return to your household and make your arrangements. I will expect you or the one who replaces you within 1 week. If no one appears, I will come to find you." With that, the fearsome figure turned sharply and strode back toward the house without a backward glance. Marcel stood rooted to the spot, watching until the stranger vanished into the chateau's shadowed doorway. There was nothing to do but go home and tell his children exactly what he had done. Somehow, he would put things in order so they could manage without him. Perhaps, once the man's anger had cooled, he would show a measure of sense and mercy and not keep Marcel for very long. With the storm blown through and daylight to guide him, Marcel found his way from the estate road back to the main highway and urged the mare onward toward home. He rode at a steady but unhurried pace, sifting through the heavy news he would soon have to share. The day itself was disarmingly beautiful. Mist drifted away, and the gentle sun of early autumn poured down as if it wished to cheer him in spite of everything. Birds sang with innocent sweetness, as though nothing at all were wrong. Marcel felt none of it. His chest ached with dread for the conversation to come. He reached the cottage late that night. His children rushed to greet him, their energy bright and expectant. They were certain he had brought back the finery they had asked for. Laughing and tugging playfully at the saddlebag straps, they reached inside for shoes with sparkling buckles and velvet caps with elaborate trimmings. Marcel, full of regret, could only place a rose in each outstretched hand. Elodie lifted her flower and breathed in its fragrance with unfeigned delight, admiring every perfect petal. The other 5 were not satisfied whatsoever. They demanded to know where their real gifts were. That evening, gathered tightly around the crowded kitchen table, Marcel told the entire story of his ill-fated journey. How the creditors had taken everything. How the storm had driven him to shelter. How he had eaten by a stranger's fire, how the rosebush had tempted him into breaking his promise of good behavior, and how the owner, fierce as a legend and unwavering as iron, had set the terms for repayment. When he concluded by saying he would have to return and work off his debt, the 5 eldest erupted into complaints. They pouted loudly and asked with great indignation how they were supposed to manage without him. Elodie alone said nothing. She stared at the table unreadable, thinking in a deep, quiet way that no one else in the room seemed capable of. At last she lifted her head and asked for silence. Startled, because Elodie rarely insisted on being heard, her brothers and sisters fell quiet. She announced that she would go to the estate and take her father's place. Marcel's eyes filled at once. He protested that he could never allow such a thing, that under no circumstance whatsoever would he send his youngest into the service of a stranger who had shown himself so severe. But Elodie's reasoning, calm and steady, proved difficult to deny. Father was needed at home, truly needed, to arrange work, to keep the family's modest income alive, to guide the others who were plainly lost without him. She, on the other hand, could be spared. She had learned to keep a household running. She could cook, clean, and attend to tasks with diligence. There is no other sensible solution, she finished gently but firmly. I will be the one to work off what we owe. It took only a day or two for Elodie to prepare the few possessions she would take. As the rose her father had brought began to wilt, she pressed it carefully between the pages of a book. She wanted a reminder, plain and powerful, of why she was leaving the life she knew to serve a fearsome stranger in a remote, isolated house. She was frightened, yes, of course she was, but her determination to make her father proud and to protect her family was stronger than fear. The morning of her departure rose bright and clear. She and Marcel packed her things into a small cart and hitched it to their faithful mare. The chateau would take 2 days to reach at a walking pace with the little cart in tow. Marcel knew an inn where they could sleep on the first night. The older siblings came to the cottage door to see them off, a complicated mix of relief and reluctant admiration on their faces. They were glad they would not be left to manage for long on their own. The road felt solemn beneath their wheels. On the first day, the sky remained fair and the travel was simple. Their night at the inn passed without incident. On the second morning, however, autumn staked its claim upon the forest. The wind rose and worried the branches. The first crisp brown leaves skittered across the path in quick little dances. The mare kept her steady rhythm, drawing them closer and closer to the moment of parting neither father nor daughter wanted to reach. When Marcel recognized the turnoff to the estate, his heart began to break by degrees with every step the horse took. Sensing his spirits falter, Elodie gathered her courage and gave him a reassuring smile. "Do not worry, father," she said in a voice made to soothe. "I am capable. I will be all right." He nodded, hoping her words would prove true. At last they came to the gloomy gate. Marcel pushed it open again, led the mare through, and guided the cart toward the imposing house for the second time. Elodie stared openly. The elaborate but untended gardens and the severe, soaring walls made a scene more grand than anything she had ever imagined. It overwhelmed her, and yet it possessed a kind of stark beauty. Raised in a village with low rooftops and friendly lanes, she felt the mystery and the permanence of this place in her bones. The very stones seemed to sleep with one eye open, as if they had been waiting for a very long time to be noticed again. She wondered what sort of work would be required of her here and prayed it would not be beyond the abilities of the former keeper of a humble cottage. Marcel halted the cart at the foot of the wide front steps. A side wind came suddenly and shoved at them, almost as if the weather itself wished to send them away. He climbed the stairs slowly, lifted the heavy knocker, and let it fall. Father and daughter waited, bracing themselves for the arrival of the house's ferocious master. To their surprise, The door opened not to reveal the towering figure from Marcel's memory, but a boy of perhaps 13. He wore plain village clothes and peered out with frank curiosity. After a brief, thoughtful look, he nodded as though something had been confirmed in his mind. "Is one of you the new helper?" he asked. Marcel blinked at the unexpected question, then explained that he had brought his daughter, Elodie, who would be serving in his place to settle the debt that had been demanded. The boy nodded again, as if this were exactly what he had anticipated, and pulled the door wide, motioning for Elodie to come inside. He told Marcel to leave her trunk in the entry and be on his way. Then he scurried off into the depths of the house, no doubt to announce that the new servant had arrived. With the wind at her back, Elodie crossed the threshold into her new life. The farewell that followed between father and daughter was brief and aching. They both wore brave faces because anything else would have undone them completely. Marcel turned the mare homeward under a weighty sky. He did not look back until they had passed through the gates, and then the trees closed behind him like a curtain. Elodie stood uncertainly in the echoing hall. Gray daylight filtered through the high windows above the door, but it did nothing to warm the vast space. She held herself a little closer to her trunk and reminded her heart that courage must be practiced, not merely imagined. After a few minutes, the boy returned at a run. "The lord of the house says I am to take you to your room," he announced cheerfully. He hoisted the trunk with a practiced grip and started up the broad, curving staircase. Elodie followed, surprised to be going up rather than down to a kitchen or scullery. Perhaps she thought she would be tucked into some attic corner. Instead, the boy, who introduced himself in passing as Rowan, turned down the very first grand corridor. Their quiet steps moved over heavy carpets as they passed portrait after portrait of long-ago nobles. Their painted eyes seemed to follow her, not with malice but with the cool assessment of people who had watched generations come and go. Elodie stared so intently that she nearly walked into Rowan when he stopped at a door and pushed it open. Inside was the most handsomely appointed bedroom she had ever seen. Not enormous, no, and certainly not gaudy, but the canopy bed, the fine fabrics, and the glow of dark, polished wood were deeply luxurious. She noticed a small dressing table and a window seat with cushions that invited a person to curl up and watch the world. Rowan knelt at the hearth, coaxed a fire to life, and rose with a grin once it was crackling. "I help the master here with all sorts of things," he said. "I am glad you have come. It gets very solitary sometimes, and I truly do need help with the daily bits and pieces." Elodie did not yet know what those bits and pieces might be, but she thanked him sincerely for the fire and asked when she would meet her employer. Rowan explained that the Lord had said he would see her in the morning to explain her duties. For now, Rowan would bring a simple supper, and he hoped she would rest well. With that, he slipped out and closed the door so softly it hardly made a sound. Elodie took a steadying breath and began to unpack. She hung her few dresses in the large wardrobe and set her small collection of books on the bedside table. Opening the one on top, she looked at the pink rose pressed between its pages. With a wavering smile, she closed the cover and set it aside. She drew back the heavy curtains and tucked herself into the cushioned window seat. From there she could see the courtyard spread below, the paths bordered by plantings that had grown wild, the stone walls draped in vine. Evening drifted in, and the wind worried leaves and twigs into little spirals. Dark clouds hurried past the rising moon. Exhausted by travel and by so much newness, she dozed for a few minutes, cocooned by the curtains. A soft knock roused her. When she opened the door, a tray waited on the floor. Bread, cheese, a bowl of soup, and a cup of hot tea that breathed steam into the cool air. She glanced up and down the corridor. Rowan had vanished like a shadow. She carried the tray to a small table near the fire and discovered only then how hungry she was. She ate every crumb and drained the cup, then slipped beneath the coverlet without much ceremony at all. The bed held her as if it had been made to fit her, and within a minute, perhaps less, she was asleep. Her dreams were strange. She walked the chateau's dark corridors following a large, silent dog whose paws made no sound whatsoever. The animal slipped into one room, then another, always reappearing a few seconds later as if urging her on. When she reached a certain doorway through which it had just disappeared, she looked in and saw not a dog but the back of a man seated at a desk. He began to turn toward her, and just before she could see his face, she woke. She sat up in the gray-lit room. The fire had dwindled to embers. Daylight pressed gently at the window. As her thoughts settled into wakefulness, a knock sounded. Rowan stood outside with a tray. "Good morning, Miss Elodie," he said with a politeness that felt sincere. "I have brought you a little breakfast." Then, with a motion toward the direction of the front hall, he added, "The master requests that you come to his study when you are finished." Elodie nodded, accepted the tray, and he vanished once more. An hour later she stood, nervous but composed, at the threshold of the very room where her father had found warmth and food on that stormy night. She heard the shuffling of papers within. She gathered a breath, cleared her throat, and knocked softly on the door. The scraping of wood across stone ceased, and for a breathless instant silence weighed upon the room. Then, from behind the desk, a towering figure emerged. His height alone was daunting, but what struck Elodie most was the heavy curtain of hair that framed his face, lending it a grim cast. His features seemed carved in bold strokes, a scowl written into their very shape, as though nature itself had set him to wear severity. It was not merely that he was strange to behold. He was intimidating in a way that pressed on the chest and demanded composure. Elodie's instinct was to shrink back, but instead she bowed her head with quiet courtesy. The man studied her with eyes that measured rather than welcomed. After a long pause, he inclined his head in return, the gesture awkward, yet not without meaning. With a slow lift of one large hand, he motioned toward a chair placed near the hearth. Then he settled heavily into the armchair opposite. "I understand you are here to discharge your father's debt," he began. His voice was low, its roughness carrying the growl of some untamed thing. "Tell me, are you skilled in the plain but necessary labors of a household? Cleaning? Preparing meals?" Elodie nodded, careful not to let her nerves show. Yes, she could do those things. A flicker of satisfaction touched the man's severe face. He reached for a massive ring of keys that rested on the table beside him. They clinked together with weight, ancient metal holding the sound of years. "As you can see, help is scarce within these walls," he explained. "Rowan tends to my simplest needs. His mother brings bread, milk, and eggs each morning, and he runs to town when errands are required. Beyond that, there is no one. I keep to myself, and the estate has been left to suffer neglect. That much you have no doubt observed." His gaze was steady, waiting. Elodie's throat tightened at the enormity of what he implied. She was to care for all of this sprawling, echoing mansion nearly alone. Yet she held her tongue. To speak of doubt would only prove weakness, and weakness she could not afford. The man, who she now knew to be the master of the estate, Antoine, continued, "These keys open most of the rooms, though you will find little reason to wander into many of them. Should you require something Rowan cannot fetch, come directly to me. Otherwise, I prefer not to be troubled over minor choices. You may make such decisions as seem fit. My days are largely consumed in this study or in the library." Overwhelmed, Elodie could only incline her head again, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Antoine rose abruptly, and the conversation was finished. Rising with him, she accepted the ring of keys he offered, its weight surprising for its size. She nodded once more and turned toward the door. "Dinner is at 7. His voice called after her, deep and commanding. "It would be prudent for you to join me in the dining hall." She promised she would and stepped out into the vast entry once again. There she paused, staring down at the keys spread across her palm. They seemed less like tools and more like a symbol of trust and authority she had not expected to be given so soon. Her thoughts were broken by Rowan's sudden appearance. He bounded from the shadows with his easy grin. "Shall I give you a tour, Miss Elodie?" Grateful for something familiar, she agreed. And so her first day as the new housekeeper of the chateau began. Rowan spoke freely as they wandered. The master, he explained, had lived here alone for many years. His fierce bearing had made him a figure of dread in nearby villages, where gossip grew wild and cruel. People whispered tales of monstrosity and avoided him when he appeared in town. Only Rowan had bridged the distance. At first he had been nothing more than a boy sent on errands, but over time he had grown to know Antoine for who he truly was. "His bark is harsher than his bite," Rowan declared with certainty. Each morning Rowan came to the estate, helped where he could, and at night returned to the modest cottage where his mother waited. "Truly, miss," he insisted as they passed down a shadowed hallway, "the master is just. He is fair and kinder than most imagine." Their steps carried them through room after room. Elodie discovered that vast stretches of the house stood abandoned. The keys she carried turned in locks that groaned, opening upon chambers that smelled of dust and time. Furniture was shrouded in heavy sheets, fireplaces empty and dark. Some rooms had not been touched in decades, perhaps centuries. In certain places, trunks and cabinets were stacked to the ceiling, cobwebs knitting them into forgotten monuments. Light that should have fallen bright through tall windows was dulled by layers of grime upon the glass. There were, however, a few places still alive with use: the kitchen, Antoine's study, the front hall. And then there was the library. Rowan allowed her a brief glance while Antoine was elsewhere, and the sight made Elodie draw a breath of wonder. The chamber was immense, its ceilings soaring high, gilded trim catching the light. Bookcases climbed to the very top of the walls, interrupted only where windows admitted thin streams of daylight. Along the cases ran rolling ladders, waiting to carry a reader to whichever title might beckon. And the books, there were more than she could begin to count. Spines of crimson, green, and deep navy stood in ranks, brown leather volumes bearing the patina of years. Each one seemed to whisper an invitation. Elodie, who had treasured a handful of books through her father's years of decline, could not have imagined such a treasury existed. Rowan told her that Antoine spent most of his hours here, and the proof was plain. Open tomes lay in stacks, passages marked, pages splayed as though in mid-thought. Two worn armchairs beside the hearth bore the shape of long occupation. "I must keep the fire always lit during the day," Rowan said with gravity, "for the master never wishes this place to feel cold." Elodie pictured herself in one of those chairs, a book in her hands, the fragrance of aged paper mingling with the scent of smoke. The thought was intoxicating. Yet the house required work, and she knew it. That first day she and Rowan began with the front hall and the kitchen. Years of dust yielded slowly to cloth and broom. Elodie was not a master cook, but she delighted in restoring the kitchen's order. She sent Rowan into town with a careful list of provisions, and while he was gone she cleared counters, polished pans until they gleamed, and coaxed the cavernous space back toward warmth. By evening, with little time to spare, she roasted a chicken, simple but satisfying, and hurried to freshen herself. In her chamber Rowan had already kindled the fire anew. She washed at the basin, smoothed her hair, and chose her neatest dress. Drawing the curtains against the still courtyard below, she felt the silence pressing like a spell. Not a bird stirred, not a branch swayed. She thought again that the place held secrets waiting to be uncovered. Taking a candle, she descended the stairs into the grand dining hall. The chandelier overhead sparkled faintly, like a constellation set above their heads. At the far end of the long table, 2 places had been laid. She sat first, and soon Antoine entered, his immense frame filling the doorway. With a curt nod, he motioned her to the table. "I see you and Rowan have not been idle," he remarked, his heavy brow lifting at the meal. "For many years the boy has carried burdens beyond his years. I am glad you are here to share them." Elodie bowed her head, murmuring, "My lord," but he interrupted with a brief shake of his head. "No titles. You may call me Antoine. I am lord of nothing but these crumbling halls." There was bitterness in the jest, but also truth. Then his eyes softened just slightly. "I regret the harshness of the terms that brought you here. Still, I hope you will not be entirely unhappy. I do not seek to be cruel. Company is a gift I had not expected." Her heart eased at that, and she managed a faint smile. "Would you wish me to clean the library tomorrow?" she asked carefully. Antoine considered. At last he nodded. "Yes, and you are welcome to take any volume that pleases you. Descartes once said, 'The reading of all good books is like conversation with the finest minds of past centuries.' My library has an unusual way of holding nearly every book you might imagine. It is, in its way, a sort of magic." His words startled her with their civility and depth. Watching him as he ate, she felt her view shift. He was still fearsome in form, yes, but not devoid of kindness. Perhaps this life was not destined to be as bleak as she had feared. They dined mostly in silence, broken only by the sound of cutlery. Later, folded into the white sheets of her canopy bed, Elodie felt a fragile hope take root. This place was strange, yes, but it breathed with hidden life, and she was determined to uncover it. The following morning, after tidying the kitchen, she approached the library with caution. Antoine was in his study, so she began her work quietly, dusting, straightening, moving carefully between the stacks, until she nearly disturbed a pile of volumes. "Do not shift the stacks," Antoine's voice warned from the doorway. She startled, then stammered an apology. "No harm," he said more gently. "It may look disorderly, but I am tracing my research. I cannot risk losing my place." He tilted his head. "Have you chosen a book yet?" She admitted she had not, confessing her fear of attempting works too lofty for her understanding. Antoine's mouth curved in something like a smile. "Awareness of ignorance is the beginning of wisdom," he said. At her puzzled look, he added with a playful glint, "Socrates. He believed questions were the first step toward truth." He plucked a slim volume from a shelf and pressed it into her hands. "Take this. His words will suit you well." She thanked him, and before leaving turned back with a question of her own. "Might I ask some villagers to help clear the gardens before winter?" Antoine's expression dimmed. "If Rowan can persuade any to come, yes. But few dare to cross these gates. Tales about me have grown long and cruel, and so I remain alone." Elodie's brow furrowed. "How can you endure such falsehoods? Does it not anger you?" For a long moment he looked downward. Then he said quietly, "Once I was handsome and vain and unwise. Misfortune stripped away those illusions. If the world scorns me now, perhaps it is a fitting payment for old follies." She did not press him further, but resolve burned in her chest. She would learn what had shaped him into this man. For now, she carried Socrates back to her chamber, eager to read. In time, she grew into her role and even came to cherish it. By coaxing and bribery, she managed to have Rowan hire several villagers to tend the gardens. She warned them sternly to spare the rosebush by the pergola, for it had been planted by Antoine's mother and was precious to him. Yet when the men worked, she overheard their muttering. "They say he is a monster," one sneered. "Lives like a beast, unfit for company," another added. "Still, I will take his coin." Elodie glanced up to see Antoine at a window, listening. Distressed, she rushed to shut it, wishing to shield him. But he waved her off. "I am long accustomed to such talk," he said. "It has been many years since I belonged among them." Her heart ached. "But how can you bear their cruelty? How do you not despise them?" He lifted his gaze to the books on the table. An Englishman named Shakespeare once wrote, "Heat not a furnace for your foe so hot that it do singe yourself. Hatred burns the one who holds it. Better to forgive and lighten the burden." Then, with a faint nod, he added, "You might try his plays. They are worth your time." He turned back to his work, leaving Elodie to ponder his words, and to feel the quiet stirrings of admiration that surprised her. The house was vast, the labor heavy, but in its shadows, a different kind of life was beginning. As autumn took firm hold, days crisp and bright, dusk arriving early, and the chill of evening pressing gently against old stone, Elodie began to roam the corridors with a candle cupped in one hand and the heavy ring of keys looped securely around her wrist. Long galleries were lined with doors whose locks had not turned in years. Patiently, key by key, she tested each one, intent on learning exactly what histories lay sealed behind those thresholds. Most chambers proved to be bedrooms. It was unmistakable that, in its grander age, this country house had welcomed a parade of noble guests. Now each shadowed room, draped in dust sheets, revealed carved four-posters, costly cabinets, and armchairs upholstered in once fine fabrics that had dimmed to sober tones. The hush inside felt layered, as if time itself had settled there in soft strata. Late one afternoon, when the light fell in narrow bands across the floor, she opened a door unlike the others and stepped into a room that had very clearly been a lady's own domain. Unlike the stripped and impersonal chambers she had seen before, this one still held the imprint of its mistress. A slender dressing table stood laden with jars of powder and delicate flasks of perfume that caught the sun and sent small sparks of brightness across the mirror. Nearby, resting upon carved stands, towered elaborate wigs of an older fashion, ornamental marvels from decades past, poised as if waiting for music, laughter, and a dance. When Elodie eased open the wardrobe, her breath caught. A neat procession of silk gowns hung inside, unapologetically decadent and utterly of another era. She brushed her fingertips very lightly along one fragile skirt, half afraid the fabric might crumble at even the kindest touch. In her mind she saw the woman who had worn them, poised, admired, moving beneath chandeliers with a smile that lit the room. A chest of drawers offered further evidence of that vanished life. Necklaces lay coiled in bright strands. Velvet-lined boxes preserved glittering trinkets. In a small case, a ring winked up at her, its sapphire so alive with color it seemed to hold a pocket of afternoon sky. Instinctively, Elodie closed the lid at once. She would not, under any circumstance whatsoever, risk appearing a thief. She slid the drawer shut, turned the key in the lock with careful quiet, and withdrew. It felt as though, for a hushed moment, she had stepped through a door into a happier time and then stepped back again. Of everything she had discovered within Antoine's walls, that room was by far the most beautiful. Elodie kept up her letters home. Rowan carried them to town whenever errands called him there. In each note she assured Marcel that she was treated well and that the work, though ample, suited her hands and her mind. Before long she began sending a little money, too. After her first month, Antoine had insisted seriously, without the slightest hint of jest, that she could not continue without pay. Whatever damage had been done to the rosebush, he said, had long since been balanced. He wished her to remain not as someone compelled to labor off a penalty, but as the rightful housekeeper of the estate, and for that he would pay a weekly wage. Elodie accepted with grateful relief. The position demanded every ounce of her order-loving nature. Beyond the quiet satisfaction of restoring neglected spaces, she found genuine comfort in the master's thoughtful company and in free access to his astonishing library. The longer she worked beside Antoine, the easier it became to forget that others called him unsightly. Outwardly, nothing about him had changed. He was still broad-shouldered, his features strikingly bold, his beard unruly, but Elodie kept his garments brushed and properly mended, and sometimes, catching a fleeting reflection in a hallway mirror as he passed, she would see, astonishingly, a man of ordinary, even agreeable looks gazing back. At other times, while they spoke, the severity of his features seemed to relax into harmony. Then she would blink and the impression dissolved, as if the house itself enjoyed playing gentle tricks. With a small, wry smile, she wondered whether the old magic of the chateau sometimes reached out to nudge her perception. When the wind turned sharp and pitiless, strangers occasionally appeared at the door, wayfarers unaware of the estate's reputation who had drifted up the drive in need. In Elodie's home village such callers were often rebuffed with hard words. The prevailing view was that want resulted from faults of character, and that was the end of it. She half expected Antoine to send these beggars away. Instead, his instruction was simple and unmixed. Give them a hot plate and a few coins before they continue on. The first time she asked why he extended generosity when the surrounding people offered him none whatsoever, he answered by invoking a thinker he admired. A great-souled person, he said, drawing on Aristotle's teaching, does not go about asking favors, yet remains fully ready to do kindness unasked whenever the chance appears. Then, with a rueful edge to his voice, he added that he must learn to be more truly great-souled, for the road that had led him to ruin had been of his own choosing. Elodie could draw no more from him that evening, but her desire to understand his past kindled a little brighter. Not long after, they dined together in the warm flicker of candlelight over a hearty winter stew. Choosing her moment carefully, Elodie asked how it was that he had become so completely alone in this vast house. Antoine leaned back, sighed deeply, and took a contemplative sip before he spoke. When he did, the words came slow, shaped by regret. "Many years ago," he began, "I lived here with my mother. My father died while I was still young, and the estate fell to me earlier than it should have. My mother. She was truly lovely, not merely in appearance but in temper. She could be the life of a room and somehow remain unfailingly kind to every last person in it. The rosebush your father stripped bare, that was her doing. She planted it." He paused, plainly uncomfortable, then continued. "When illness took her, I was left alone with my inexperience, and with my vanity. I did not live well. I wasted money on showy baubles and foolish parties. I neglected the lands, ignored accounts, and failed the people who depended on me. Without her steadying hand, I became poor in character, useless to anyone, even to myself." He described a particular night when the rooms were crowded with revelers and a servant came to say that a woman stood at the door asking for bread or a small coin. "I could not be bothered," he said, and the pain in his voice made clear he felt the shame still. "I told my man to advise her to seek work elsewhere." Before he could dismiss her, she pushed through the cracked door and told me to my face that my foolish vanity had brought a curse upon me, that I would live spurned and unloved, and that the key to release lay in humanity and nowhere else. Elodie's brow drew together. Humanity? What could she have meant by that? Antoine lifted his hands in a small, helpless gesture. That is the puzzle I have wrestled with ever since. It seems, perhaps as part of whatever enchantment holds me, that I have at my fingertips an inexhaustible store of the finest works by our species. Philosophers, mathematicians, poets, scholars. I read, and my mind improves. Of that I am certain. And yet all that brilliance has never loosened this shape or this solitude. Somewhere in that word lies a door I have not yet found. Elodie listened, hearing the light crackle from the hearth punctuate the quiet between them, and imagined how many winters he had spent turning pages with no companion to share his discoveries. Sensing the heaviness of the moment, Antoine managed a small, bright smile. A certain natural philosopher once remarked that the simplest truth may demand years upon years of contemplation. Perhaps, one day, the simplest truth will come to meet me halfway. That night, curled on her side beneath clean sheets, Elodie felt as though scattered fragments had finally clicked into place. For years, Antoine had turned toward study, toward reflection, toward repentance. He had become a man who would not withhold kindness, even from those who had given him none. Still, she wondered, what more could he possibly do? Would he remain bound to this place with only books for company and old mistakes for memory? She hoped with her whole heart that such a fate would not hold forever. The last embers in her grate glowed softly as she drifted to sleep, and the vast, listening quiet of the house wrapped around her. Winter kept its crystalline grip for a long while. Inside, however, life found a gentle rhythm. Elodie saw to the rooms they actually used. Antoine and she read and spoke in low tones, and Rowan, cheerful, reliable, served as their faithful link to the outside world. Most of the mansion stayed locked. The small portion they needed remained warm, orderly, and alive because Elodie insisted upon it. Meals were simple and steady. Outside, the courtyard rose into clean, dazzling drifts of snow, and sometimes the wind sent a bleak whistle down the abandoned passages. The three inhabitants kept close to the hearths, their days marked by turned pages and sustaining routines. At last, the first unmistakable hints of spring appeared. A clearer light, softened earth, the whisper that color would soon return. With them arrived a letter from Marcel. He wrote that Elodie's eldest sister had made a match and that the wedding would take place in a few weeks. He asked, respectfully yet full of hope, whether the Baron would permit Elodie to come home for the celebration. If permission were granted, Marcel would gladly come to fetch her. When Elodie presented the request, Antoine closed his book and looked at her with a sad, tender kind of smile. He answered without hesitation that she must, of course, go, and that she should take all the time she needed. As Elodie thanked him, her eyes performed their strange mischief again. For a heartbeat she did not see a fearsome figure at all. She saw a man, simply a man, thoughtful, decent, a little weary. She had to blink several times before the old impression returned. Pausing in the doorway, she glanced back, then left him to his reading and tried to set the moment aside. The journey to the wedding and back proved uneventful. Her family welcomed her with curiosity and a touch of new respect. They admired the tasteful clothing she had purchased with her wages, and they sensed, without her saying a word, that the money she sent had helped secure her sister's modest but solid match. In village eyes, the family no longer looked impoverished. Thanks to Elodie's steady remittances, they were viewed as settled and acceptable. And yet Elodie, seated at the familiar hearth among siblings who busied themselves with small grievances and narrow ambitions, felt curiously out of place. The rooms seemed smaller, the air more crowded. She regretted leaving Marcel once again, as she always did. Yet the honest truth was that she felt relief the instant Antoine's gates appeared before her. She knew exactly where she belonged now, in the quiet rhythm of the house that had become her charge. Her relief turned to dismay the moment Rowan opened the door. He was delighted to see her, yes, but worry clung to him. He whispered that everything had gone awry in her absence. Antoine had sunk into a deep gloom, ignored his meals, and scarcely left the library. Elodie set down her things and went straight there. The sight that met her eyes was a complete undoing of her earlier efforts. Books lay open in precarious stacks and across the floor. Empty glasses ringed the tables. Dust had crept in again, and Antoine himself slumped in a chair wearing a shirt that had not seen fresh water for days. When he looked up and recognized her, relief, pure and unguarded, moved across his face. And again, for the briefest instant, she saw him as any ordinary man, unthreatening and human. It took a breath and a blink for the familiar, harsher outline to reassert itself. Elodie went to work at once. Within a few days, order returned to the library and to the routine of the house, and with it Antoine's spirits rose. In a quiet moment Rowan begged her, sincerely, almost desperately, not to go away again. The very day she had left, he said, the master had collapsed into melancholy and forgotten even to eat. Elodie promised to do what she could, though she knew duty to family might call again. Spring pressed forward with a happiness that could not be ignored. The foresight that had led Elodie to clear the garden before winter now bore fruit. The courtyard shone. Beds laid out long ago by Antoine's mother displayed their thoughtful design again. Flowers unfurled in a spectrum of gentle hues. Birds multiplied by the week and sang with a sweetness that invited the house's occupants outside. Elodie and Antoine began carrying their books to the pergola for afternoon reading, and more than once Antoine released Rowan early so he could spend time with friends rather than with brass and brooms. Windows were thrown open. The long stale air of the mansion shifted to freshness. Across the estate, life did not merely feel new. It felt as if the whole place had turned a significant corner. Near the edge of summer, Marcel's handwriting arrived once more. Another sister was to be wed, and Elodie was invited again. Obligation tugged in one direction. Memory of Antoine's desolation pulled in the other. She was caught between them. The plan she proposed surprised even her. She suggested that Antoine accompany her to the village and take a room at a nearby inn. He need not stand through the ceremony if crowds unsettled him. The point was that he would not be left alone to so quickly unravel, and she would not be forced to worry from afar. He responded with near alarm. "You have seen for yourself how people react to me," he said, voice rough with dread. "How can I place myself before them knowingly?" Elodie had expected that answer. She told him her village lay far enough away that rumors about him had not had time to harden there. Privately, she no longer saw him as terrible in any way. She saw the thoughtful, fair-minded man she had come to know. Surely the people at home would meet him with at least a small measure of fairness. The oddity of a gentleman of rank attending a village wedding meant nothing to her. In her heart, Antoine was neither beast nor baron. He was simply Antoine. He refused. He refused again. Elodie then said, quietly but with immovable resolve, that she would not go without him. Faced with the prospect of keeping her from her sister's wedding, Antoine yielded at last. Consent did not bring peace. As arrangements proceeded, he dreaded the journey with every fiber, and a shadow seemed to follow him from room to room. Elodie made cheerful, careful preparations. She sent Rowan to the tailor with Antoine's measurements and specific instructions. The flamboyant finery of earlier decades must be retired. The new suit would be clean-lined and dignified, clothing for a man of the present, not a costume from the past. Rooms were reserved at the inn. The carriage was inspected, harness checked twice. Rowan promised to prevent the estate from sliding back into chaos while they were away. Wide-eyed, he admitted he had never once seen Antoine cross the gates. When the appointed morning came, Rowan wished them luck with an earnestness that made Elodie smile. The horses pulled, the wheels turned, the chateau slipped slowly behind them. They covered the distance to her village in a single day, for the roads were sound and the season generous. Summer had begun to show its open-handed exuberance. Fields thick with green, hedgerows alive with birds, a sky so blue it seemed freshly polished each hour. As the carriage rattled along, Elodie stole a glance at Antoine and let herself hope, truly hope, that the world beyond those walls might see, if not everything she had come to see, at least some small, shining part of it. The steady rhythm of hooves rang along the forest road, echoing softly against the trunks while sunlight streamed through the canopy in shafts of golden light. Birds, bold with the freshness of the season, poured out their jubilant songs overhead, and the tender green of new leaves whispered against one another as a breeze wove its way through the branches. At first, Antoine sat stiffly, shoulders drawn and lips closed, as if in some silent protest against being drawn out into the open world. Elodie allowed the quiet, holding her thoughts, until at last a mile or two slipped away and a familiar subject arose between them. She mentioned the book she had been reading, and that was enough to coax him into talk. Soon the stillness had melted into their usual animated exchange. Ideas sparking, wit unfolding, voices bright with shared delight. Glancing at him in profile, Elodie felt a sudden thrill, for she could have sworn she was traveling beside a man not fearsome but genuinely handsome, even charming. She smiled faintly to herself, unwilling to dispel the strange and gentle enchantment of that thought. The road wound on until day softened into twilight and the first crickets began their chorus from the hedgerows. The carriage drew up before her family's cottage, and the pair descended. No sooner had their boots touched the earth than the entire household spilled out through the door. Four of her unmarried siblings crowded the threshold, staring at Antoine with poorly hidden astonishment, some of them whispering coarsely to one another. Only Marcel managed a proper courtesy. He stepped forward, bowed his head slightly, and thanked Antoine with genuine gravity for escorting his sister and for gracing their home with his presence. Yet even as he spoke, Elodie felt her cheeks heat in shame when one of her brothers bent close to an elder sister and muttered some jest that sent the girl into giggles. The disrespect was obvious. Relief came when Antoine excused himself and departed for his lodgings at the inn. Elodie let herself be ushered indoors, listening patiently as her siblings chattered of gowns and invitations, cakes and garlands. She asked polite questions, though her mind strayed again and again to Antoine. Was he being treated fairly in that unfamiliar place, or was he enduring mockery there as well? The thought weighed on her until she laid her head down, and even as sleep pulled at her, her last awareness was that she longed for this wedding to be over so that she might return with him to the chateau, which felt now to be her truest home. The following morning the church bells tolled, and Antoine appeared grim as he joined her. Elodie knew at once that her fears had been right. He had suffered. They sat together in silence throughout the ceremony, the small chapel pressing in on them as though the eyes of the entire congregation were fixed solely upon their pew. When the service ended, the gathering moved to the village green, where long tables were set with punch, sugared cakes, and garlands of wildflowers. Children ran and tumbled across the grass, and the air was alive with laughter. Groups of women in their best caps and shawls gathered in circles, nibbling daintily, while men lingered in clusters, their voices rising and falling in mirth. But for Elodie and Antoine, the scene held no joy. She remained faithfully at his side, offering a stiff nod here and there to acquaintances from childhood. These were the very villagers who had once taught her to knead bread and tend a garden, and yet they now looked through her with a knowing glance, whispering behind raised hands. Not one word of welcome was extended to Antoine. He endured the scrutiny with composure, offering gentle smiles, but her heart burned with humiliation at the sight. Her own family, meanwhile, turned their backs as though she and her companion were invisible. The moment of sharpest cruelty arrived when two men, standing not far away, spoke loudly enough to be overheard. One, with a mocking smirk, said, "He may have wealth enough, but no woman will ever be persuaded to bind herself to a face like that." The other chuckled harshly. "It's a sorry day when a man must woo his own servant girl," he sneered. Elodie felt fire rise in her. She set her glass of punch firmly down and stepped forward into the center of the green. Her voice, when it carried over the merrymakers, was steady and commanding. "I asked Antoine to accompany me here," she said, "because I believed you all to be decent folk. I was certain that his generosity and his goodness would be so plain that none of you could mistake them, and that you would see clearly he is not the beast you have imagined him to be. I was wrong. Not one of you has proved yourselves worthy of his company. From this day forward we will trouble you no longer. Mark me well. Antoine is more honorable, more gentle, and more steadfast than any man among you. If I had to choose a companion 100 times over, I would choose him every single time." Her words dropped into the air like stones into still water. The company fell silent, eyes moving from Elodie to Antoine and back again in astonishment. And then, before her very eyes, the impossible occurred. The figure she turned toward was no longer the hulking, harsh-featured lord she had known, but a man of noble bearing and undeniable handsomeness, gazing at her with gratitude shining in his eyes. She blinked rapidly, rubbed at her vision, even turned away and back again, but nothing altered. The coarse beard, the exaggerated features, the looming proportions were gone. What remained was a man as fair as any she had ever seen. More extraordinary still, the others seemed to register nothing unusual. The villagers resumed their laughter, their eating, their dancing. Some even approached Antoine now with friendly greetings, as if they had never recoiled from him at all. The cruel whispers were as if they had never existed. It was baffling, miraculous, and yet unmistakably real. In that unlooked-for instant, the spell was undone. All the years Antoine had pored over his endless library, searching philosophers and poets for answers, he had been circling the wrong question. The woman's words had not meant that wisdom written on pages would free him. It was the growth of his own spirit, his patience and generosity, his humanity lived out and proven by love, that had opened the lock. Elodie's courage, her steadfast defense, had crowned what he had become, and the enchantment dissolved. Not long afterward, the pair could be found once more beneath the pergola in the garden of the chateau. The rosebush his mother had planted bloomed gloriously again, perfuming the dusk as crickets took up their chorus. Antoine, now revealed in all his dignity, turned to her with earnest eyes. From his pocket he drew the ring she had once glimpsed in that preserved lady's chamber, a sapphire set in velvet blue. "You alone took the trouble to see me as I truly was," he said, his voice warm with feeling. And, as was his way, he turned to wisdom borrowed from a book. Copernicus wrote that at the center of everything stands the sun. You have become that sun for me. He gave her a wink that carried both humor and devotion. Besides, I think you have shown yourself more than capable of managing this house. Elodie laughed through the sudden tears in her eyes, and she let him slip the gem onto her finger. Its bright light winked at her just as it had when she first discovered it among the treasures of long ago, as if affirming that she herself was now woven into the history of the place. By the height of summer, vows were exchanged in the courtyard, surrounded by roses heavy with fragrance and birds pouring down their music from the trees. As they stood side by side in the shadow of the house, Elodie felt her heart brim with gratitude. A year before she had crossed that threshold burdened with dread. Now the same stones enclosed a home where she belonged, built not of grandeur or duty, but of kindness, patience, wisdom, and love.